Hi everyone, my name is Musa Hussain. Thanks for joining me, and today I'm going to be presenting an ethnography of 350 New York City, the climate group and its strategies and actions as they relate to the theory of intersectionality. So while often seen as monolithic, the climate movement has actually developed in two quite separate camps. This is climate justice and climate action. Climate action developed on the more national stage, informally established groups that had the backing to assert themselves in society, while climate justice groups began on a much more local stage in poor Black and brown communities scattered across the nation. So the fight for climate justice, like I said, really began in these poor Black and brown communities, and it really failed to kind of get that same backing that the climate action movement had. So it's clear that the climate movement has failed to diversify itself along race and class lines, and this is largely because of a failure to evoke key emotions such as anger and frustration in the general public. And also because the climate movement lacks an identitarian aspect, unlike other issues like racism or even poverty. It's really failed to mobilize a lot of people. Wealthy white people with less immediate struggles are those who end up being the ones who care about climate change and join the climate movement. So however, while the climate movement faces intrinsic, inevitable difficulties in mobilizing people, its historical framing of climate change has exacerbated these difficulties by failing to fully acknowledge the immediate effect of climate change, as well as climate change's connections with a host of other social issues such as poverty and racism. The movement has really not given people of color and those in poverty reasons why they should join the movement. And so without inclusivity and diversity, the climate movement lacks the credibility to both build connections with other social justice groups, but also lacks the unique lived experience-based viewpoints that could help articulate the intersections of climate change and help the movement appeal to a much wider audience. So the term intersectionality was first coined by Columbia professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used it to describe how race, class, gender, and other characteristics intersect to create interlocking systems of oppression. Since her first use of the word in 1989, the term has been really widely used and popularized. And so the way I'm going to be using the term is to understand how a climate group might take an approach in its internal and external operations that is recognizing of the ideas and arguments posited by the theory of intersectionality. So climate action and climate justice groups really approach climate change in a different way using different strategies. If we take a closer look at a climate justice group in New York City, We Act, and a climate action group, Sierra Club, we can kind of understand these differences a little better. So as you can see, all of We Act's areas of work really emphasize the group's focus on climate justice or speak to the direct effects of climate change, such as too hot or too cold homes, clean air, or other really immediate effects. Sierra Club, on the other hand, while the issues they speak about have humanitarian implications, they're a lot less immediate, and even some of them are based on things like wildlife and forests, which really lack that humanitarian aspect that a lot of climate justice groups speak about. And so in my theoretical approach, I'm going to be using a multi-institutional politics approach by identifying the multi-institutional logic of 350 New York City. And so this approach understands power to be deeply connected to cultural and other types of systems, whether that be racial systems or ethnic systems. And so with this approach, I'm going to be focusing on the issues, targets, and tactics used and focused on by 350 New York City. So in terms of my methods, I had two primary ways of collecting my data. I had 8 one-hour interviews where I spoke to members about their experiences in the group, what they felt were group pros and cons, and how the group and they themselves understood intersectionality. And then I also sat in on 8 meetings 350 had over Zoom, and I just observed group social dynamics, where the group was putting the most energy, and other dynamics like that. So I had 3 primary focus points of my data analysis. This was group framing of climate change and its solutions, so how they understood the best ways to address climate change, and then internal group workings and structure. So this was kind of the characteristics of group members, how group agendas were set, and dynamics like that really internal to the group. And then finally, I looked at the group understanding and efforts at inclusivity, diversity, and intersectionality. So how the group understood how they could become more inclusive and diverse, and how they understood climate change's connections with these other issues like racism and poverty. So in terms of the group framing of climate change and its solutions, the prioritization of political and corporate issues, as well as the fact that the group primarily connected with other climate action groups, and a deep group sentiment on the importance of educating the public really show that the group is really a climate action group rather than a climate justice group. So 350 New York City is actually divided into 4 working groups, of which are divestment, transportation, local issues in the media task force. And you might be thinking, local issues, is that climate justice or climate action oriented? But in the local issue meetings I sat in on, all of the points were really climate action based. For example, we discussed lobbying HFCs, we discussed divestment a little more. So really all of these working groups, aside from transportation, are really focused on political and corporate issues within climate change, rather than direct issues or community-based issues. And then in terms of the internal group workings and structure, the group actually has quite climate justice-based characteristics, as it has a really open agenda setting process, and people feel really comfortable in the group, rather than what might be a much more bureaucratized style in groups like Sierra Club. And then on the other hand, the lack of diversity, as well as the fact that most members were motivated by either people like Bill McKibben, or the fact that they're retired, really show that the group is more of a climate action group. So this is another climate action kind of principle in the group, because members lack the lived experience that would allow them to fully recognize and focus on the direct issues of climate change. So this lack of diversity, it really represents kind of a climate action-based approach of the group, because they can't really recognize these issues that affect disadvantaged people of color. And so then there are 2 interesting observations here that speak to the complexity of issues within climate groups and becoming more inclusive and diverse. So a lot of people mentioned that they chose to join 350 New York City because of its geographical convenience, or they mentioned that people of color and community-based climate justice groups kind of want to stay in their own communities. And so here we can really realize that where a group is located and its historical style and existing membership really influence how climate action or how climate justice oriented the group is. And then in terms of the group understanding of intersectionality, the group members actually showed a really pretty deep understanding of how climate change disproportionately affects people of color and how it affects disadvantaged residents the most. As you can see from these quotes, they're pretty thorough in their understanding, which contributed to the fact that the group does understand climate justice, and they do have this pretty deep understanding. And so ways they suggested the group could become more diverse and inclusive were that they believed really connecting with more diverse groups in the city, perhaps groups like We Act was the primary way the group could become more diverse and inclusive. And however, while these ideas seemed genuine, and I really believe they were pretty vague and didn't really offer any specific plans of action, and kind of just said, hey, we should connect with these groups, but there weren't any specific group names mentioned or specific ideas the group had in mind. And then also contributing to the group's climate action based approach is the fact that they mentioned that prior to the Black Lives Matter movement and even the pandemic and the inequalities it has exposed, the group hasn't really gotten into climate justice or race, as you can see from some of the quotes here. And then another interesting observation is that almost all group members spoke about increasing diversity and inclusivity in the group by connecting with other groups, but barely any members actually spoke about directly increasing the diversity of the group. And so this kind of shows that the group accepts that its location and membership make it intrinsically a climate action group, and that it's more focused on becoming a more supportive ally to climate justice groups than actually becoming a climate justice group itself. And so then following my data analysis, I concluded that 350 New York City is primarily a climate action group because the lived experience of the predominantly white upper to middle class membership influences them to understand power and social change in a way that leads them to believe that politics or influencing corporations is the primary way to affect change rather than more community-based solutions. And so the group struggles, but does make a pretty bold effort to recognize climate change's connections with other issues and become more diverse and inclusive. And especially, with the Black Lives Matter movement going on and this period of economic and racial unrest, the group is really examining its position as a climate action group that might not want to become a climate justice group just because of its location, but really wants to be a supportive ally. And then finally, I'd just like to thank everyone who helped me in this project. My mentor, Professor Bernstein, Dr. Moscardelli, the entire honors program, Mr. and Mrs. Holster. Without these people, this project really would not have been possible. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.